And thanks everybody. Thanks for joining us. And by the way, Scott and everybody else, let me know if for some reason the slides aren't, going forward, or the audio. As we all know, there's all those little things. So I'm Bill Proud. I've been working with our Sophos public cloud team for a while. I'm actually part of our global organization, like your MSP folks that are on the team. But we're really specifically focused on helping build out the Sophos portfolio. And I'll talk a little bit more about that as it relates to public cloud. This is what we wanted to cover today. I want to try and introduce you, if you haven't heard of Cloud Optix, to really help you understand, what type of technology is this and how does it differ than some of the traditional security technology that you're probably familiar with if you're on this webinar. We'll do that with some slides. We'll go into a demo. We'll also talk about some real world use cases. What are people using this technology specifically for, so you can really get your head around it, as well as some suggested customer engagement type questions. How do you start a conversation to see if this might be a fit for a customer? We'll also talk about another integration point between our products. Scott talked about our great MTR service and how it has a connector that's coming out very soon, so that we can gather information from Cloud Optix, these cloud environments, to really help paint a better picture of your overall security posture. Well, we're also going to talk about how we've also integrated and started pulling together some other products, specifically our server with EDR functionality, and it now has Optix features available as just an additional value for customers. And of course, we'll try and make sure we leave some time for Q&A, and I'm hoping the team can make sure to keep us honest on the timing for that. So let's talk a little bit at the beginning just about what we mean when we talk about our public cloud products. The reality is that we're really blurring the line at this point in the industry. We talk about cloud versus on-premise, because as you guys are all aware, every organization of different size, verticals, wherever they might be, they're increasingly using cloud services. So it could be something like Office 365. Perhaps they're hosting virtual servers with, applications which are essentially workloads in the cloud. And the way that our product portfolio really helps customers in that sense, as you can see it here, is, first of all, we're taking a look at, the on-premise aspect. So on the left there, you can see our traditional products, which you guys are probably pretty familiar with, next-gen firewalls, endpoints of various types, and so forth. Now, those same products in many ways are going to be suitable to help protect customers as they connect to the cloud. So, the endpoint protection is obviously protecting against any kind of local host infection or password stealing or any other kind of malware. We have great protection there. Same thing with our next generation firewalls, our XG firewall. There's even cloud broker type capabilities in there, so you can really get a better handle on what cloud applications that your teams are using, make sure they're in line with your security policies. But once we move actually into the cloud, that's when it gets a little confusing for folks. What we're talking about there is a combination of the existing products just modified so that they're more aware of their environment. So in the case of our XG, you can spin that up in AWS or Microsoft Azure using templates that we provide, which simplify the process of creating a virtual network and everything along those lines. Now, our server agents, they work anywhere. So if you have a Windows server on premise or a Windows server in AWS or Azure, to us, it's the same thing. What's different might be you might want to automate the deployment of those agents to capture any kind of servers that maybe teams are spinning up, because that shadow IT kind of behavior is very prevalent in the cloud, and that leads to security incidents. And that kind of subject is really specifically what a product like Cloud Optix can help with. It's there to give you visibility, which we'll go into more, but that's the main focus of our talk. But as you can see, there are other products, including Intellix. If you're not familiar with that, that's just of a special interest for anybody who might be building their own applications and want to utilize security functionality. In this case, it's from Sophos Labs, so you can actually, using API calls, create and run different types of lookups on files, submit them for analysis, different things like that. And everything that we have is really fed by our or managed from our central management platform. So that everything ties back together, feeds information, and as you probably know from our strategy, that's going to continue. That's why we talk about these product integrations and touch points, so that you can essentially use the portfolio to build out a security posture tool set, which will cover your environment on premise or in the cloud. Now, when we talk specifically about Cloud Optix, this is a newer type of technology that's referred to as cloud security posture management. And you heard me say that a couple times, because one of the challenges as the IT infrastructure moves to the cloud, as workloads, data applications move to the cloud, is essentially we have a large and expanded attack surface now, and we don't completely control every aspect of it the way we would in a physical network we would have on premise. So that obviously has some implications. And because in the cloud, much of the tools that we use may be provided as services, there's a lot of confusion about who actually is responsible for security. And cloud security posture management tools help with that. And we'll go into the details of why, but they really bridge the gap between cloud providers and the responsibilities that customers and partners, like we all are, play in maintaining a customer security. So Cloud Optix itself is specifically designed for visibility, to enhance security and compliance and keep an eye on things as they're changing, as well as to set up and allow for response capabilities. So if you've ever heard terms such as DevOps, some of the ways people are working with automation tools and cloud tools, that's really what we're talking about here. So a little more in depth on those different three pillars, if you want to call them that. If we look at visibility, what we're really saying here is, again, when people move to the cloud, you're giving up some of your control and a lot of your visibility, because you are putting your data, your applications, on either virtual servers running in the cloud at AWS or Azure, or using a service that somebody is managing for you, where you put your code or your data in, whatever it might be. It's very difficult sometimes to really get a good handle on what's out there, especially because of the way that the cloud changes how teams work, because very often in the cloud, more people have access to the services and have more permissions to do administrative level type things than you would ever find on premise. And so what that means is, I refer to shadow IT, you very often have situations where the IT team responsible doesn't even realize that maybe development or business teams are creating resources in the cloud. When we say resources, they could be virtual machines or those services we talked about. So it's very difficult to understand, and if you can't see it, obviously you can't secure it. And then because of the dynamic nature of the cloud, you've heard things like auto scaling, or just the kind of workflows I described a moment ago, where there's so many teams or hands in the pot. It's difficult to really maintain that level of security that you might need, or even to understand where you are at any given time. So that's a huge challenge, and that's, again, one of the things that we try and help with. And because of those different teams, instituting workflows. How do you make sure, if you're on the security team and you see that there's an incident, or you're a partner like everybody on the call today, if you're managing security for a customer and there's an incident, what's the handoff? How do you make sure that maybe an IT ticket is created, or that the person who needs to resolve it has the information they need, because perhaps they're not an expert themselves? So that's really what we're talking about with response, as well as different ways to utilize automation and so forth. So when we talk about that with Optix, what we're really talking about is continuous visibility. This is like having, an expert always watching, or even a team of experts always watching to see what is your security posture, what's out there, help you understand where you go. And to Scott's point before, a big part of that too in the cloud is controlling runaway costs. So there's a security aspect as well as the spend monitoring aspect. We offer visualization tools in a number of different ways to really help customers understand these complex relationships, where traffic flows might be, who has permissions to do what are the ramifications of those permissions. And then, again, when we talk about maintaining, we refer to it as compliance. That could be external compliance like FedRAMP or PCI, but it could just be your security governance. What do you want to keep secure? If your policy says that you should be ensuring that certain type of data is never exposed to the public, how do you maintain and ensure that's actually happening? And then again, those response capabilities, understanding what everything looks like and being able to react when there is an issue, or if somebody does something that could affect your security. That's what we're talking about here. Now, a lot of this, as I mentioned, relates back to how security is handled in the cloud. Hopefully, if you're working with the cloud, you've heard of the shared responsibility model. This is essentially how the major cloud providers, AWS, Azure, Google Cloud, this is how they operate. They provide the actual cloud, which you can see at the bottom, which means the data centers, the virtualization layer, they're responsible for all that. But then once a customer actually creates a virtual network, starts utilizing services, placing data, virtual machines, whatever it might be, into those cloud environments they create, well, then the responsibility is really on the customer or the partner in that case, because they have to make sure they understand how to use the encryption tools to keep that data secure, how to manipulate the security settings on your virtual networks and your virtual machines. And then at the top, you can see up there, it's also suggested that depending on your requirements and your workload, perhaps you should be installing additional layers of security, whether it's for something like PCI compliance, maybe an IPS, or if you want to put a host agent on to protect lateral movement, whatever the use case might be. This is all recommendations, but not enforced by the provider. Now, when we talk about our portfolio again, you can see the way things stack up a little bit. It's easy to understand those couple examples that I just gave and how our traditional appliances from, our next gen appliances or our agents might fit in. But Optix, Cloud Optix is really looking at the lower layers, you can call it, the infrastructure settings. Those are those cloud, settings that I talked about, which are really the ones that are tripping people up. So knowing how to configure the network security policies, understanding, what's out there, who has access to it, what are the data security controls in place, and are they enough? That's really what we're talking about here. And, to expand on the concept of cloud challenges, different than they might be on premise, what we do is try and think of it a little bit like a black box when you think of your on premise. Because if you take a look at that graphic on the picture, you can kind of consider the way you would defend or attack that depending on your perspective. You don't have many choices because you have one pretty clearly defined way to get in or out of that particular building. And that's very much similar to how we've traditionally architected where it looked at security on premise. Of course, we use our agents for host level protection, but when you think about actually getting in or out, you typically have that well-defined perimeter. You can put your security devices there, your firewalls, your web application firewall. But if somebody wanted, for instance, to get access to one of your servers from the internet, you have to talk to a team. You have to actually go and somebody has to set up rules, whether it's a NAT policy or something else. So it's not as simple as it would be in the cloud. Because when we look at the cloud, the first thing that we have to realize is that instead of that kind of black box that we just saw where you have one door in or out, the cloud is designed for access and based on APIs. So there's actually, instead of one defined perimeter, you essentially have many perimeters, because all of the resources that you create, virtual machines, or if you create, or if you start using something like a storage service, they're designed to be accessible from the public internet. And that's those security controls I mentioned before. And so if you're not paying attention and understanding that you left a window open, somebody can just go right in, of course, and that's what happens. So when we take a look at the cloud, there is definitely the use, as you can see, with our firewall and agents, which is very much similar to how we architect on premise. that's definitely still valid because you're going to have a virtual network. You still have that kind of structure and those use cases for allowing traffic to pass through security devices and enforce your policies. But where it really changes is, I mentioned before that, for instance, many people who have access to the cloud environments typically have more permissions than you need. So it's a very simple matter for them to maybe change a routing entry so that that virtual machine is no longer sending its traffic through the firewall, something that the IT security team may not even be aware of. And instead, that device is now effectively directly connected to the public internet. And if you're not paying attention to the security group settings, for instance, that machine may be exposed on, very well-known administrative ports, 3389 for Windows, SSH port 22, and that's where you can get exploited without even realizing it because you're unable to understand what changes might be happening. And the same is true, or even more so, for the services you might be using. Again, the way people use the cloud is not just virtual machines. They're also typically using things like, say, the S3 storage service in AWS. And what that means is, just like I described for a virtual machine, it's actually probably even easier to just change the settings for that storage bucket to be public versus private. And if that happens, which happens quite often, anyone can exfiltrate data. And there's all kinds of tools out there that bad guys use to go find these open storage services or VMs, whatever it might be. Okay, so again, that's really what we're talking about when we look at Optix and the value it provides. Okay, because most of the security incidents, they start out with misconfigurations. People just unaware something's happened, or maybe they don't even know because they just don't have the cloud expertise. And especially when many customers are using multiple clouds, it's very difficult to be a complete expert in both, even though the concepts are the same. Just going through the actual UI, for instance, the administrative console, can be a little bit challenging if you're not familiar with them to ensure that you have proper security. So misconfigurations can really lead to these security incidents. That's what everybody is seeing, and that's just a jumping off point typically for the bad guys. So let's take a look at Cloud Optix now, and let me just pause this a little. And sorry, folks. All right, not the most elegant switch over, but you should hopefully be able to see my Sophos Central dashboard now. So Cloud Optix is now part of Sophos Central. So what you would see is the ability to, if you have the product, just jump right into it. Otherwise, it's available for things like free trials. And when you do connect into Cloud Optix, you're going to, of course, have a dashboard. And you can see my dashboard here, which is going to right away start giving you some useful information. There's a variety of filters which can be applied for things like date and time, of course. There's some features we've put in to help with administration and education. You can see those or not. But essentially what this dashboard is trying to show you is your security posture and your compliance posture at any given time. Now, just the way we do with other central products, there's different things for role-based administration. So you could set up different types of access profiles. But if we take a look at this, first of all, we're going to have a summary of alerts as well as some details on the specific top alerts. We're going to have our overall compliance, score, pass versus fail, so that we can really start delving into where we might have exposure. And I mentioned a couple times, one of the biggest problems that we face is that so many people typically working in these accounts have the permissions to do changes. What we've done is we've used Sophos machine learning to actually identify and help really point out and focus on things which could be considered what we consider to be high risk changes. Okay, it's not just us, these come from like CIS benchmarks, but as an example, I had talked about the case where somebody could change a route, which could then effectively change the way a virtual machine connects instead of through a security device directly to the internet. So these are the type of things that we can bubble up right away so somebody can understand, hey, this could definitely affect our security posture. Now, in the first slide, when we really started talking about Cloud Optix, I mentioned this is an agentless solution. So the idea here is that we can connect different types of what we call cloud environments to the Optix system. And this is all done through the APIs. So there's nothing to do except, connect using the administrative cloud credentials that the customer would have. And we offer different types of options. So for instance, if you're using AWS, we have very simple up to very much more complex type of onboarding or installs. And this really just helps with how the customer is approaching things. They may be simple AWS users, or they may use what's called AWS organizations and have many accounts connected together. So either way, this can help with those type of situations. So we can handle these type of accounts, and we have, as you can see here, support for AWS, Azure, GCP, Kubernetes, container management systems, as well as what we call infrastructure as code environments. So in the cloud, customers are very often building out those virtual networks and deploying their applications using essentially templates or scripts. This is a proactive way to actually take a look at those for security issues before you start building the environments, prevent problems from coming in. But once you do have everything connected up, the whole idea is that these different cloud accounts or cloud environments are going to be in constant communication with Optix, so that we can continually update and scan for any kind of changes or security events. Okay? And what that'll mean is, first of all, for visibility, we'll build out a inventory. And some of the things I'll point out is that we're going to give you high-level views. I mentioned before the ability to drill down. There's some pretty sophisticated search capabilities that are built in. But at a simple level, what we're trying to do, again, is draw your eye to potential security issues. So in this case, you can see color coding, hopefully. In this case, for a host, we could see that it's color coded because these are publicly accessible hosts. And if I take a look, I could see all the details, including, drawing my eye to what exactly is the potential issue here. And what I can see here is that this particular host has access pretty much on any TCP port from anywhere. Well, that's obviously something we would want to take a closer look at. Now, we could see which virtual machines are affected by this setting as well, so that we have a broader view. And we can look at this information in different views, including more of an kind of a network diagram type of view. We can see if there's real traffic flowing, but we can also see implied traffic, again, color coded, so we can see important information. Okay, so there's quite a bit of different ways that we're trying to display information, which can really help customers make sense of how communications happening in the cloud, where those potential issues might be, because the whole purpose is really to help you with security hygiene, we'll call it. Now, besides hosts, we do inventory continually updated with things like containers, your virtual networks, okay, and the security groups they use. We do storage services that we talked about as a frequent area of exfiltration of data. And we even do the identity access management services. So again, we talked a little bit about how many people in the cloud typically have more privileges than they need. And I'm sure everybody's familiar with the concept of least privilege. Well, when it comes to the cloud, it's just not as simple as that because of the policies used. It's very common for people to have many more privileges than they might need, which can then, of course, lead to problems. So if you take a look here, what we do is we build out, first of all, a inventory of all the different user accounts or roles even that might be used in the cloud. We do some static look at it and we say, hey, according to best practices, for instance, MFA is not enabled, or your access keys, it's time to rotate those. But we also analyze it and take a look at the actual privileges. So we say, hey, this person has access to X number of services, but in the last 12 months, they haven't actually used these ones. And then we even, again, use that machine learning to identify ones that are potentially high risk, so you know really where to start looking and cutting down those privileges. We'll keep developing this so that we can actually suggest the changes for that. And we even do some very clever visualization, because again, just like with the network visualization I showed you, it's sometimes a little bit more impactful to be able to see stuff. In this case, the relationship between something like a user and a key resource. So, going back to that example of the storage service, again, very common to have people steal from there. We can say, what's the relationship between users and the storage service, S3 and AWS? And what we could do is get a better picture on who has access to that service, who might be overprivileged, what kind of path they might take to get there. And then we have details both on the overprivileged, what I showed you, as well as the specifics of the actual service and the resources they have access to. What kind of permissions do they have? Read, write, that could be a problem if somebody got hold of the credentials for this user. So again, the whole idea here, we're trying to really help make sense for customers and partners on what's going on and where their problems might be, so they don't necessarily have to be experts. And Scott had mentioned one important point, which extends to things such as the spend. So currently, the way we do that is we ingest information on the top services which are used, and we also give you the ability through a combination of profiles as well as some artificial intelligence to really understand if you've gone over perhaps a certain threshold. We've spent 10% more within a given period, a day, a week, or a month. That could be valid, or it could be indication of some kind of malicious activity. It's up to the customer to really determine what is happening, but at least now they don't have to just wait for the bill and realize, wow, we actually had somebody break into one of our accounts and now we owe X amount of money. This is an indicator of compromise very often. Now, besides that visibility, we talked about maintaining things. That's done through a combination of our policies that we create. So there's various policies that we create out of the box for things like CIS benchmarks or some of the external compliance regulations like HIPAA or GDPR or PCI. And we also give everybody the ability to customize policies. So these could be more specific to a customer's needs. Perhaps we are going to modify some of the rules that we want to use by turning them on or off, or the severity of them. There's also some automatic remediation capabilities so that you can tell the policy in Optix to actually fix a problem, such as that S3 bucket, which is open to the world. We can apply policies to very specific cloud accounts or to even specific resources based on things like tags. So there's a lot of flexibility, and this really leads into some of the workflow management we talked about. We feature integration with a number of different IT ticketing services and solutions, things like Jira, Slack, ServiceNow. I understand, some of the common tools that might be in use by MSPs might not show up here immediately, but what I would point out is there's things such as the Optix API, so that all this information can be pulled into different systems. There's also options for email alerts or filtering and using what they call the simple notification service from AWS, which has not only email but other capabilities for sending alerts. So there's quite a few different options, and the idea being that you're keeping an eye through a combination of your inventory, your policies, and Sophos machine learning, and where you can then understand and be alerted when there are issues. So in the case of having one of those VMs that's actually open on a port such as 3389 to the entire world, well, that's something that is pretty critical. We want to know about that. So the alert, based on the policies that we just discussed, it's going to generate something that's very similar to what you see here. Well, this alert is exactly what you see, but the other ones are very similar. Quick summary, description of why it's a problem, remediation steps, including official documentation. So this is exactly what we can use and send through either automation or manually. I could do that. Send these alerts to somebody and help them understand how they can resolve the issue. Now, what's nice is if you're using something like Jira or ServiceNow, we have direct integration, a two-way integration we call it, because if you create the ticket in something like Jira or ServiceNow directly from here, what that'll do is actually then put the ticket ID from that system in the alert, allow the alert to stay essentially open or alive until that's resolved. So you really understand what's happening. So it creates a nice automated workflow for you. Okay. Now, besides these type of alerts that we have, which have the information, we're going to have similar information in our reports. Now, these are going to be generated each time that we actually do a scan, which is a configurable period of time. And that means that we have historical reports to look at. So we can understand if things change perhaps over time, what might be happening. But the reports, similar to what we just looked at, are going to tell you, where there might be problems. And they're going to give you a very similar kind of look and feel in the sense that, hey, here's the problem, here's more details about exactly what it is. So altogether, the whole idea, as we talked about, is to increase your visibility, help you maintain your security posture or your current security settings through changes. And that's one thing actually I failed to mention, is that we're also ingesting logs. Okay, these are different types of logs from the providers, which are going to track user changes. So if anybody makes those changes, such as the route table we looked at, or if anybody is spinning up new instances, whatever it might be, we're going to look at that, have all that information, and again, we do that analysis. So this is very useful here because obviously we can see all these different events which could be affecting my security posture. And because we're looking across all of our accounts, it's also a very useful tool to help us just with management or troubleshooting any issues. All right. So that's a pretty quick look. Now, we're happy always to do much deeper dives with these type of things, but for now, we're going to jump back into our slides and just continue talking a little bit. All right. So, I mentioned a couple stats early on and talked about one of the main things that we kind of have to worry about with cloud. When people start putting, things in the cloud, virtual machines, applications, data, whatever it might be, these workloads, there's the potential for misconfiguration, which, as we saw some of those third-party reports, show is very high. It's happening to most customers. And we did our own study as well. We commissioned a study and it backed up what we were seeing. I mean, more than 70% of the customers surveyed suffered a security incident in the cloud. And almost 60% of those were successful ransomware attacks, okay? Remember, when we talk about the cloud, most often people lead by putting their servers in the cloud, okay? And servers have the most valuable data typically, so that's probably not too surprising a number. But it really just relates back to a lot of what we know today. That's a big part of why we have our Sophos endpoint and server technology, right? InterceptX is specifically designed to help with these more advanced attacks. Our EDR functionality helps look for indicators of compromise and different things like that. So this is where we start seeing, the value of multiple products, really. But let's talk a little bit about some real world use cases. Now, one of them refers back to something that I talked about before, which was really the spend monitoring capabilities as part of, a security posture management solution. Now, it sounds great because you're able to just identify the fact that, hey, I'm spending more money, but the reality is we approached it because of this type of use case. We actually had customers that came to us because they were suffering crypto mining attacks in the cloud. Essentially what happened is they had some contract employees had their access keys stolen. And those are the keys to the kingdom. And as I mentioned a few times, typically in the cloud, people are overprivileged. Of course, the attacker then got into the cloud accounts. In this case, it was a dev account. They did their typical, just like if you ever look at any kind of the kill chain stuff or MITRE attacks, you take a look around, and then you start really shoring up your defenses and launching your attack. In this case, it was automating the provisioning of resources to run the crypto mining operation, trying to lock people out by hardening some of the settings, again, through those elevated privileges. So the way that, we can help with some of that is, of course, customers working with partners can implement better security practices, okay? That's key, obviously. So things like, making sure that you're using your own private, repositories for any kind of source control management. Don't give too much out to the world. Let's protect our keys properly, okay? But then it goes into the cloud. If they had implemented best practices, they wouldn't have had this type of problem, Okay, if they'd been using all those different provider tools as designed and recommended, they would have been able to stop stuff very early on, even if those keys were exploited. That's what Optix can help with. Okay, understanding these changes that the attacker was making, the activity, all that stuff is what I mentioned in those activity logs. He would have been tripping all kinds of alarm bells, even if he did have those permissions to do the stuff that we're talking about, because Optix is keeping an eye on that stuff. And then again, using machine learning and different types of techniques to bubble up what looks like it might be suspicious. Okay, and that cost anomaly, that would have caught things right away as well, because again, if we set a threshold and we all of a sudden see within one day our usage has gone up 10% in the dev count, well, let's talk to the dev team and understand what changes they're making. If they're not doing anything abnormal, let's look a little bit deeper and use our logs, reports. Let's understand who's making those changes, talk to that person. All that information, again, is quickly available in Optix. And then, ultimately utilizing something like our server protection could have really stopped a lot of this, both at the initial stage, but also from the exploit part, when they actually put their payload on there, when they were doing stuff. Our 0-day protection could have helped there. Okay, and then really coming back to recommendations on how to make sure everything's set up. Again, the way we could have done things there. We could have definitely helped these type of customers, and we did help them later on, of course, after the fact, to prevent it from happening again. Now, this next use case is really a little bit, could be a little bit familiar, because this was actually based on this is a really high profile use case. Essentially what happened was, I mentioned misconfigurations. High profile customer misconfigured a service or a server. Scanners took a look, the bad guys, they saw that their chance, they launched a brute force attack, they got in. So they exploited that type of misconfiguration. Then they exploited the operating system running on the VM to gain some further privileges. They used some misconfiguration of what they call the metadata service. Basically, this was a sophisticated attack. So the way Optix would have helped in our server protection, of course, is one, we could have blocked that right away, right? We could have protected against the initial intrusion. Something like a WAF would have protected if it was an application attack. Optix, with its artificial intelligence alerting, can actually take a look if we see some type of the metadata service methods used here. And we would have seen, again, this type of odd activity and exfiltration, coming from, sources that we don't typically see. That's how Optix really could have helped with this type of stuff. So there's a number of ways along the kill chain we could have stopped this. Okay, and we'll just quickly go through some of those because I didn't paint the picture while we were talking. Okay, so again, what we're looking at here is really covering areas that traditional security tools are not able to. So if you're having a discussion with a customer, obviously if they're working in the cloud, first things that you might want to take a look at is what they're using. They're typically going to be using a combination of things like storage and database services, virtual machines. They may be using containers. These are all perfect, examples of how Cloud Optix can help. Because again, Cloud Optix is going to keep an eye on the settings which surround these different services and assets. So Cloud Optix is the first thing I would talk to customers about. But then, I mentioned before that it doesn't work alone. Server protection, or what a lot of people refer to as workload protection in the cloud, that's key for stopping a lot of these, traditional malwares that we're seeing, or new advanced malware in some cases. Same thing with our next-gen firewalls. Things like web application firewall technology is absolutely necessary in these type of environments. Okay, but when you're engaging with a customer, you might want to take a look at compelling events to understand, because more and more everybody's moving to the cloud. Obviously, we saw there's a lot more remote working. That's really changed. We've seen tons of customers coming to us where they're moving stuff into the cloud now. They're moving up projects which they may have planned. For instance, we saw healthcare customers that all of a sudden greatly pushed up, their move of a data center to AWS, because they realize they're very liable for sending people in during the pandemic to their own data centers, and they want to kind of remove that liability. Okay, obviously, if there's a security breach, they're going to take a closer look at where they might be vulnerable. If they're using the cloud, that's going to be a key area. And if they're using compliance, again, it's very difficult to understand if an auditor came in, are you PCI compliant? Well, something like Optix can really help you out there. Okay, some qualification questions that we might want to, talk about is really just understanding, how are they using the cloud? They probably are, right? Are they planning to move more to the cloud? Most people are in some way, right? Maybe they just want to use a service in the cloud. Maybe they're taking a look. Microsoft is pushing them to, with Azure credits, very common to replace on-premise hardware. Are they storing data in the cloud with something like S3 or Azure Blob? So there's a number of different qualification questions that you can ask to really get the conversation kind of started. Now, first thing that we hear a lot of times is, Optix sounds very interesting, but doesn't the provider provide some of these tools themselves? You look at something like Azure Security Center, at its surface, it sounds very similar. So do some of the AWS services, but the reality is a lot of what those services are providing are pieces of the functionality we are discussing. So what you have to end up doing as a customer or partner is really kind of pulling these together, stitching these different tools together, and in many cases paying for multiple services, especially if the customer is using multiple clouds. Okay, so the idea is that with something like Optix, instead of paying for those individual tools or maybe creating and then maintaining your own applications to tie them together, the idea is obviously utilizing a service that's delivered through our central console. So much simpler. And one of the key things about it is that we found this out ourselves. Before Sophos had Cloud Optix for our own use, we were doing exactly what I described, stitching together all the provider tools and then creating our own, type of tools to fill the gaps that were not there. It becomes very costly in terms of resources and effort, and we have to constantly keep up with the providers and all the changes they make. So that's why we ended up actually acquiring the technology that's Optix. We use it in-house, and we realize, this is something customers need as well because they're in the same dilemma. So now when we talk about MSPs, there's a number of different ways that you can obviously sell something like Cloud Optix. Okay, it's part of the MSP Flex program, with monthly billing. There's also, if we're talking with AWS customers, or if you're a partner that works with AWS, there's different options for what they call private offers, where you can actually negotiate term prices for customers in conjunction with Sophos so they could get much greater savings. And this is done with AWS, which has a number of different benefits, including things like co-selling opportunities. So definitely interesting. If you're interested in learning more about that, we have our public cloud alias that you can see down at the bottom there. Okay, very interesting options there. Now, when we talk about Cloud Optix, we've used terms such as asset or resources or so forth. A lot of these are generic, but when we talk about it from a licensing perspective, what we're really talking about here, to Optix, a cloud asset that's something we license on is really a virtual machine, okay? Or a database or a container, but they all come back to the same thing. In AWS, they're EC2 instances. In Azure, they're VMs. They're going to be those virtual machines that these, applications are going to run on. We'll count those up, and that's what we use for licensing. So things like the newer technologies, the actual number of containers, no, we're not actually doing that. We're actually using the nodes, the virtual machines that are running those containers. So it's a very simple way to do licensing. Okay, it's something Gartner actually, called us out on because they think it's very simple and makes it easy for everybody involved. And when we talk about term licensing, basically what we do is we just have these license packs so customers can understand, well, I have X number of virtual machines, running in my cloud environments, and this is across all the, if they have Azure and AWS, we count the total across them, those different accounts. And there's also flexibility to grow. Customers can purchase additional ones, with additional packs as they add new machines on. So it's a very simple way to license and deploy. But of course, I mentioned MSP Flex, okay? That, similar to our other products, is an aggregated usage of what's going on. So we're gonna basically take a look throughout the month, understand, what is the usage, how many virtual machines are we seeing across this customer's environment and then pull that all together for the partner so that we can see. And what we're doing is we're recording assets on different given days and basically looking for, you know, what is the high number that we see there. Okay. And if you're using multiple, or if you have multiple customers and you're an MSP, what we're doing is utilizing the usage for each customer that we aggregate for the monthly billing. So here's just an example, right? If we talk about different cloud environments, you know, this could be one AWS account, this could be an Azure account, this could be a GCP account. We're going to look across during the 30-day period, and we might see, for instance, 25 VMs on one day, 50 on another. Well, what we're going to record is the number 50. And the same for the others that we then total up, which in this case would be, you know, whatever, I think it's 95. So there's some real benefits to that. Obviously, aggregating your customer usage. You know, Scott talked about some of the promos that he's running, simplifies that licensing, especially across multiple accounts, multiple clouds. That's something that's key because it gets very difficult to really start understanding, you know, what it looks like when you are combining, you know, different cloud providers, different customers, etc. So we're trying to keep that as simple as possible. We also, I talked about integration points, have just added some really interesting capabilities. Basically, if you have our server EDR product as a customer, you actually now have Cloud Optix capabilities. Not everything that we looked at. What you're going to get is a subset of the features so that you can start taking a look at, you know, what assets do I have out there to really answer those questions about how vulnerable I am. You can do limited scanning. So instead of that all day, you know, continuous scanning we do, it's more of a, you know, once in 24 hours type of scan to, again, give customers an understanding if things are changing or whatever might be happening. And some of the integration capabilities are also limited. It's for alerts, you just get email, but it's a great subset to really help customers understand, do they potentially have problems in the cloud? Are we growing in the cloud? How exposed are we? And it's just, again, included with any server EDR licenses, okay? Now, customers obviously can upgrade, get the full capabilities, but we see this together. Remember, the EDR capabilities is great for partners or IT admins or a combination that want to take a close look, maybe do threat hunting or take a look, a better look at what's running on their endpoints. Well, Optix is doing a lot of the same with cloud, and so together is a very powerful offering, okay? And I mentioned there's very simple and complex methods of onboarding, you know, Optix and cloud accounts or connecting them together. You know, specifically for our partners, we put together a very simple quick start option that we call. It couldn't be simpler. You just basically run the template we provide. There's a link right there in your Optix console, and the customer, of course, or the partner has to be logged into their AWS account. Once you do, it creates the template and it creates the connection for you. Nice and simple. Okay. And of course, we always have plenty of videos, guides. We have a full proof of concept guide we specifically wrote for partners to help them and customers really see the value through a 30-day period to try out Cloud Optix, really understand what they should be looking for in terms of, you know, any kind of vulnerabilities, what should they be paying attention to when it comes to alerting, you know, suggestions on workflow management, etc. So it's a great way to get started and really understand. And of course, it sets you up to understand what the licensing would look like. All right. And with that, let's use the rest of the time for any Q&A we might have. Steve, do we, or Scott, I'm taking a quick
can you hear me?
look. I can, yeah.
All right, sir. Yeah, we got a few questions. Just to let everybody know, we will be getting a copy of this recording out to everybody who's registered. We will also have this on the Sophos MSP Global YouTube page. Did have a question in there though, Bill, when it comes to APIs. So someone asked if we had this in the central API, which we don't as of today, but I know Optix has additional APIs. Can you elaborate a little on those?
Yeah, absolutely. We definitely do. And it's actually something that's directly in the documentation. We have actually really good help documentation. Hopefully you can see that on the screen right now. And if you go into that, can you see that, Steve? I'm sorry.
Yes. Yep. We can.
Still seeing that? And if you go in here, you could just, see our API documentation, and that'll explain, how you can actually utilize it, which APIs are available, which include things like the reporting, the alerts, the alerts, the inventory, even our scanning for those infrastructure as code environments. Okay, and this is something we're constantly adding on to.
Perfect, appreciate it. The only other question we have is, are we integrating this with Autotask? The Autotask integration we have today is going to be billing only from the Sophos Central Partner Dashboard. We are going to look at ticketing options for Autotask and ConnectWise later this year. We're actually working on scoping those out today. Hopefully that will include some of the Optix components on there as well. Again, all depends on what we have access to via the central API. If there's any other questions, make sure you guys put those in the questions. We can hang out here for a few more minutes, and if not, we can end it.
All right. Well, thanks. I want to say thanks, everybody. Appreciate your time today. I hope the information was useful. And, as we mentioned a couple times, please feel free to reach out to anybody at Sophos. If you guys have more questions, if you want to actually get on a phone with somebody and take a closer look at anything, we're always happy to help.
All right, one question that came in here. Do you have a difference between AWS and Optix? So I don't know exactly what that means. Is there a functionality? He's talking in security terms. Robert, if you want to elaborate on that, Optix. Does AWS offer anything similar to an Optix, Bill?
So if I go back to this slide, there's a number of different security services from AWS, and some of those services have some basic components of cloud security posture management. So for instance, if you take a look at, as you can see on the screen there, GuardDuty is going to do some AI assessment of CloudTrail and flow logs. It's some pretty basic stuff. At Sophos, we're constantly adding to that in our, labs infrastructure and the whole system we described. And the same thing with, things like scanning. You can accomplish that out of some of their services, but what the problem is that you may have to pay for some of these services. Some of them you don't, but some of them you do. You also have to essentially jump between consoles or stitch them together to get the full functionality. So you can see pretty clearly here, if you look at some of the major items, they're going to cover that in certain ways, but they're not going to cover everything. A lot of times what AWS talks about is they provide building blocks, and then they allow, whether it's customers, partners, whoever it might be, to really take advantage of those and build on top of them. That's really what Optix has done here.
Perfect, appreciate that. Robert, if you have any additional questions on that, reach out to your local MSP team. We'd be happy to set up an offline discussion there, going into that in further depth. As of right now, I don't see any additional questions on there, so we can go ahead and wrap this up.
Excellent. All right. Well, thanks, Steve. Thanks, Scott, and everybody, and have a great day.